This is Chapter 5, Part 1. In this chapter, we're going to continue talking about deviant behavior, but with a particular focus on theories that help explain deviant behavior, and specifically with a focus on explaining criminal behavior. Of course, very relevant and a central part of this course. Especially the sociology of crime is very concerned with trying to explain why it is that someone breaks the law, why someone becomes involved in criminal behavior, why someone becomes a career criminal. So this chapter 5, contains so many sort of important theories. There's a lot in there, so I'm going to break it up into 2 weeks. I'll take 2 weeks to cover the entire chapter. So I'll make sure and announce this to everybody. Send out an announcement, an email. But because it's going to take 2 weeks to get through this chapter, then we will be skipping. Usually we have a quiz every week, but we'll skip a week on the quiz so that you can just be tested on this chapter one time after we finish the whole thing. And again, I'll make sure and send out something about that so people know. All right, so this first highlighted point, deviant behavior elicits negative reactions, perhaps social control. So we talked about it in the previous chapter, that we define deviant behavior as a sort of behavior that gets a negative reaction, a social disapproval from other people, whether that be just society's majority or especially people who are powerful at the top of society don't like what you're doing. And certainly the criminal justice system has its process of punishing, detecting and punishing deviant behavior that's serious enough that it's been criminalized and has criminal punishments that go along with it. So that's the social control, is that you not only get a negative reaction to your behavior, but you get some sort of negative response. Society, members of society, individuals will respond negatively to your disapproved behavior. And if it's some type of behavior that breaks the criminal law, then the criminal justice system will take action and will remember the term formal social control, will use its power and authority to punish you. Okay, now Chapter 5 talks about just another way to sort of divide up deviance, is we can think of deviance as a continuum from more serious down to less serious. We talked in the last chapter about folkways versus mores. Well, the chapter does it a little bit differently, Chapter 5, where it divides it up into crimes, so those deviant behaviors that violate criminal law. But then there's also, you can think of sins, which may not be illegal, but are considered to be unethical, immoral. Say, for example, cheating on your spouse may not be something that's illegal, but it's something that most people would say is an immoral action. And so the textbook refers to those sorts of immoral behaviors as being sins. And finally, poor taste. We talked about that with folkways, for example, that if you dress in a way that's really sort of people find unacceptable or just strange or odd, just as an example, it's something that's not immoral. It's certainly not criminal, but it's something that people may disapprove of if it's a particular style or something. And so people you could sort of categorize behaviors like that as poor taste, that they cause a negative reaction in others, but not a really immoral one. It's just sort of annoying behavior to others, that kind of thing at that level. Crime is regulated by the criminal justice system. Sin is regulated traditionally by religion. Immoral behaviors could be handled in other ways too. You could, for example, if you were to cheat, on a test at the university, or to do enough bad behaviors like that, you could get yourself kicked out of the university. You may not be prosecuted criminally. You may not have really broken any laws with your bad behavior, but if it's bad enough, the university could kick you out. And so it doesn't have to be a religion that punishes you for immoral behavior. It could be other institutions as well, but we usually think of religion when we think of this term sin. So just keep in mind that really could be, institutions always punish unethical behavior, even if it's not criminal. The workplace could punish you for stuff that's not really criminal, but still violates the policies of the workplace. So again, can be lots of different institutions. And then poor taste is usually regulated by informal social control. So people will give you a funny look, they'll avoid you, they'll gossip about you and make rumors about you, and maybe they'll distance themselves socially from you, not want to hang out with you because they don't like something that you do that's in poor taste. So that's the more informal social control, more likely to be done by people at the same kind of level as yourself, your peers, in one way or another. We talked about that informal social control before. Now, an interesting section in the chapter talks about this classical approach to deviance, which was developed by one of the founders of sociology, Émile Durkheim, a French sociologist. And he studied deviance. He wrote an entire book on suicide, which he thought of as an example, as an important type of deviance, where especially in the 19th century and early 20th century, when he lived, that would be certainly been considered an immoral behavior, and you had many laws on the books too against suicide as a criminal sort of act. And so he spent a lot of time studying deviance, and he put forward a theory that actually deviance has certain, even though it really seems like, depending on the behavior, that can be really problematic, can be negative for society. It's a social problem when people commit crimes, for example. He saw that crime could also have, and ironically, surprisingly, positive consequences, consequences that can be good for society. That he referred to them as sort of functional aspects. The deviance can have functional aspects, which means it contributes to the sort of the working of the system. Now, how could deviance do that? It seems a little strange. He said that number one, that if people are engaged in deviant behavior, it communicates, maintains, and sharpens moral boundaries. So if people do something that is really condemned by other people in society, it teaches. It's a teaching moment, because say, for example, a child who doesn't really know, hasn't learned yet that the behavior is bad. Let's use an easy example of like violence. Some kids jump another kid at school, and a group of them, and just beat him senseless. And a child finds out about that. Well, if you're a parent, you get really upset, you're angry that some group of kids is picking on somebody and beating them up, and you're talking about it, you're upset about it, that communicates to a child that this is wrong and that you should never do this. It's immoral, it's unethical. It's a crime, it's a sin, depending on what level we're talking about here. And so it communicates to other people that this is bad, and so it can teach. It can also remind us, and sort of remind us through very very immediate means that, oh yeah, this is something really people get ticked off about. Look at this person's very upset that somebody did this bad thing. Well, I want to make sure I never do that, because look at what reaction this is causing. Everybody's really upset with these kids that attack somebody. So it sort of reminds people of right from wrong, and that what happens to you if you do bad things, that you really get this negative reaction from other people. So it sort of maintains and sharpens moral boundaries. So it's sort of it's sort of strengthening people's convictions and feelings that this stuff is bad. And that leads us to number 2, is that it reinvigorates morality. So even though this bad thing happens, we get outraged about it. We get upset. We see the harm that's done, the damage to the victim, and it makes us feel stronger that this is wrong and it should be stopped and maybe it should be punished, and that, boy, I'm sure not ever going to do that because that's horrible. So it's kind of good. It can be good for everybody else when they see something bad happening, something immoral happening. So Durkheim's saying it has this surprisingly good effect on the community, on society. Number 3 is it can also give a sense of self-esteem to the people who are not acting badly. Because let's say that the kids who attack somebody, they get, let's say they got arrested for it, and they get in trouble. Well, you might stand back there and say, wow, look at, I didn't get in trouble, and man, I would never do that. And look at, look, those people are really hated and unpopular right now for the violence. And, gosh, I feel pretty good about myself because I've never done that. I wouldn't do that. And so I guess I'm a pretty decent, good person. So it kind of is, again, it's creating sort of a contrast, bad over there, good over here. So it makes most of the people didn't do this bad thing. And so they feel better about themselves because maybe I'm not perfect, but I never did that, right? And so it gives people sort of a dose of self-esteem to realize that they don't do certain bad things that other people do. And so those are just some of the ways that those are not all of the ways that Durkheim talked about deviance actually having an upside to it. So deviance, let me say just since we're one that's not listed here, I think I listed it here in a moment, but at least let me say it now, we might come back to it, is another thing that Durkheim talked about, is that sometimes what's considered to be deviant at the time, it ends up, because right and wrong in some ways can evolve and change over time. It can be that things that were at the time that they happened were considered deviant, but in the end they end up being considered to be good things and as part of social change in a society. So you see this point here that says deviance is continuously refined, revised, it evolves. We become less tolerant of some behaviors and more tolerant of other behaviors. So what's deviant and what's conforming, accepting behavior will change some. And according to, this is still Durkheim we're talking about here, so according to this perspective, we're always going to criminalize or make deviant some behaviors. And if you think about it, you probably wouldn't be too difficult to think back in time. Imagine right now, if you would, can you think of something maybe 50, 75 years ago that was considered deviant, that was considered bad, that is now considered to be an acceptable, perfectly fine thing, or something that was fine back then and is considered to be bad now? So let me just throw out a couple of examples. I'm sure if you took a moment, you could think of your own examples of where things have changed, whether they're right or wrong. So, for example, there's some kind of obvious things or big changes over the past few decades. If you were to go back a couple generations, you had laws on the books against homosexual sex, that was considered to be sort of criminal, unacceptable behavior. And now, not only is that been made legal, but you also have laws changed where now you can be gay people can be married in 2020. And that's perfect. That's, of course, you still have some differences of opinion on all of this, but if you're talking about the laws, those have and we're using laws as sort of a measure of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. You see a reversal there, where something that used to be considered either sinful or something that was criminal is now perfectly fine, considered to be a perfectly fine, acceptable sort of behavior. And you could, if there's 100 different examples of going in the opposite direction. Let's just pick something that I think you could almost get to the point where you could consider smoking cigarettes to nowadays to be something that could be considered deviant, in the sense that a lot of people don't like it, and they think it's unhealthy, and they might tell you, you're going to kill yourself with those things, and the smoking is really terrible. We know all of the negative health consequences. And now you see there's all these rules and policies that people can't smoke in buildings and by other people and in restaurants, and they have to, middle of winter, they have to be smoking outside in the cold, that sort of thing. And so that's completely changed from a couple generations ago. A couple generations ago, you'd have some family TV program, and they'd take a break and cut away to a commercial, and there was some guy who was doing an advertising to the family that's watching the program about how great these cigarettes are, and you need to go buy some and smoke up, right? See, so it's perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable, and all the cool people too, all the Hollywood people, you see them in the movies smoking cigarettes and all of that. So it was perfectly acceptable behavior, now looked at kind of differently. And that's an example of a more minor thing, because it's not like people think that you're a wicked criminal or something if you're a smoker, but people kind of look at it more negatively than they did 50, 60 years ago, right? So that's just a couple of just random examples that pop into my head about how things change, and what at one time is considered okay at one time, and another time is not. Now, this is a point I was kind of getting at too earlier, is that Durkheim saw crime as necessary and a source of innovation. So again, he'd always say, part of Durkheim said that the foundation of a society is really what he called a moral order. What organizes us and helps us to coordinate our behavior with each other and to cooperate and get along and have a harmonious, well-organized, smoothly functioning society is that we have rules that hold us together. And also those rules a lot of times have this sort of moral flavor of good and bad, norms. It's, this is good, this good behavior, this is bad behavior. And so he saw these rules as necessary, the sense of right and wrong is necessary. And so if the rules are necessary, then you're going to have a downside. You're going to have to make deviant certain behaviors. The rules are going to say this is bad and that's good. So deviance is going to be something that's always there with us. There's always going to be something that's going to be considered to be bad behavior that may change a little over time, but there's always going to be something that we disapprove of. So he saw crime and deviance. Again, crime is just the more serious and stuff that's made its way into the law books, but still there's that connection between crime and deviance. He saw it as necessary and also a source of innovation. So this is one thing that actually I left off the list above about how deviance is functional. Durkheim would also say that behavior that was considered bad at the time the person committed the act of deviance could, in hindsight, in the future, we very often will look back on that and say, hold it, that was actually not a bad behavior, that was like a good behavior. And so what's deviant in the past can be seen as being good behavior now. And so, again, see if you can sit there and imagine what sort of behavior could have been seen at the time as criminal or deviant, but now we look back on it and see the act more as something heroic. Now looking in, because we've sort of changed on something. Well, again, random examples. An example that pops into my mind is that like the example of Rosa Parks that you had in going back into the 1950s and prior. You had laws in the southern states where blacks and whites were not treated equally, and you had different in the case of Rosa Parks, you had all of these discriminatory laws, and when it came to riding on a bus, that you might have to sit in the back of the bus. Depending on your color, you have to sit in the back of the bus. Well, she took a stand and broke those laws that they had at the time and said, no, I'm not going to sit here. I'm going to sit wherever I want. And so then she ends up getting arrested for that. See, so it's seen as deviant behavior. Hey, you're not playing along with the rules here. We split up black folks and white folks, and you're not playing by those rules. And so we're going to punish you for that. And so at the time, in the moment, in that situation, it was seen as deviant. But now we look back on it and we say, well, no, she was trying. She didn't like this separate sort of treatment, this double standard, these two sets of rules, one for whites, one for blacks. So she rebelled against that. And now, in hindsight, looking back, we see it as not as a deviant act, but as a heroic sort of act. And so Durkheim would see that sometimes what is seen as deviant behavior turns out in the future to be looked upon as being positive behavior and heroic, and that this deviant behavior sometimes is sort of it's a force for change, and it can be in a positive sort of direction. So again, that's just a random example. I'm sure if you thought about it, you could come up with a lot of other things that were done in the past that were seen as being criminal at the time, but then seen as being very positive and brave at a future point. Okay, this video is getting a little long. I'm going to stop here, and we'll see you at part 2.